Hi, Dr. Yandle. We're glad to see you.
Glad to see you today.
Yes, sir. I am sorry. Luckily, we have people who know more than I do getting things set up for us this morning. So we're very excited to have you this morning and so excited that you're able to talk with us.
Sure.
I am a Clemson alumni, so I'm super excited to be able to have a fellow Tiger on board. And
well, I'm glad to hear that. Delighted to hear that.
yes, sir. And so would
you like the video started for you, or do you just want to see?
I think it'll be fine.
Okay, that's fine.
Okay. All right. And so it's not me, is it? We're very excited though that you'll be able to give us an opportunity to learn new ways of examining how to use markets and property rights to protect the environment. And I've already explained that your greatest claim to fame is that you are a professor at Clemson and a dean there, but that you've also worked with some less important things, worked with the presidents and worked with the Federal Trade Commission to be able to help direct our economy. And so if you have time for questions afterwards, I've asked students to submit questions to me while you're speaking, and then I will come up afterwards and present some of their questions to you if you have time for that afterwards.
Sure. Well, tell me what is the witching hour? That is, when do we want to end this session?
Yes, sir. Our class, we have to change classes at 10:40. So,
okay.
So we have until then, but that's an extra long time for you. So whatever amount of time you're comfortable with.
That's all right. So when we're ready to go, you say go and I will share screen.
Okay, we are ready. Thank you so much.
All right, let's see if we can share screen here. And that needs to be, you have to enable my share screen.
Is that on me? Is that on me?
Right now it says host disabled.
You know how I can do that? There we go. That should be you.
All right, let's see if we can do it now. All right, I think we can.
Excellent.
All right, does everyone see that?
Yes, sir.
We are.
That's great. Thank you.
Super. Good. Well, we will talk a little bit more about this background before we get too far into our discussions, but we are talking about how property rights and markets can be used to protect environmental quality. And so it's a real pleasure to be able to have this time with you today. But to get started, I want to tell you about a high school buddy of mine. But for the sake of the students, you've got to get into a time machine. We're talking about 70 years ago when I was a senior in high school, 1951, if your mind can go back that far. At that time, there was no US EPA. There was no federal legislation that had to do with water quality or air quality or the environment. I was living in Macon, Georgia, the middle of the state. The state of Georgia had no state laws regarding pollution. So I wanted you to understand what the world was like then, but somehow we were all staying alive and making progress. I went to an all-male military high school that was the public school. We wore uniforms 3 days a week. And all the professors carried paddles to make certain we behaved properly. So now you got the picture. I had a buddy in high school who had a wonderful after-school job. He went and sat on the Okmulgee River and took samples of water quality every day, right at the outfall of a paper mill that was located on that river. So picture a large industrial plant discharging waste. And so here's a high school boy that comes down with a little bitty laboratory, and he's taking and recording levels of dissolved oxygen in that river. And so now the question, there were no regulations requiring it. There was no EPA. Why was that paper mill worried about water quality in that river? That's the question. They didn't have to do it by law, by regulation, I should say. And so there are a lot of reasons you could say, well, they just wanted to be good citizens, because if the level of oxygen falls to a low level, you get a fish kill, and fish kills are bad. And so the owners of the paper mill wanted to be good citizens. And I expect there was some of that in the picture. But there was something else. If the oxygen level in that stream did sag because of discharge going into it, then as the water went downstream, it would be harmful to the drinking water of the people who live below the mill. Even worse, there is something called common law rights, property rights, that go back centuries. Anyone who lives along a river or a lake where water washes their shores has the right to receive that water in a form where they may make reasonable use of it. And they also have to guard what they do to the water because of the next party downstream. In other words, the people downstream from the paper mill could bring a suit against them at common law, a property rights-based suit. And the common law courts were very strict. They could shut down the mill. They didn't say, oh, you've got to pay a fine. Oh, no. They didn't say, oh, you've got to put in some pollution control equipment. They could say, shut down. And when you start up, you better behave differently. And there were other kinds of pressures, economic and social, that might have explained this. But here was an early property rights story. And so in our discussion today, let's talk about the fundamental problem as we characterize it in economics. Two competing forecasts about the problem, some things about human communities, property rights stories, and a little bit about climate change, which is a big challenge. The fundamental problem has been described as the tragedy of the commons. A commons is a resource for which there are no rules of use, where there are no common law rights, where there are no regulations, where there is no systematic way to control use. So picture a huge pasture and people who live in the area of the pasture who raise sheep. If there are no limitations on entry to the pasture, then there's an incentive to add one more sheep and keep adding sheep until all the grass in the pasture is consumed by the sheep, and then you're out of the sheep raising business. That's a tragedy of the commons. The idea, the notion, was invented by a philosopher whose name is Garrett Hardin, and you see the quotation there from his famous article. And so as human communities, historically, from the beginning of time, there was a challenge. How will we avoid the tragedy of the commons? How will we ration our behavior? How will we control our behavior so that we can keep the grass growing in the pasture and keep raising sheep and not turn everything into a baseball field where nothing grows? That's the challenge. Interestingly enough, in recorded history, there are very few major tragedies of the commons. In other words, human beings have been pretty smart. They figured out a way to solve this problem, but there have been different forecasts about it. A favorite of mine is a man by the name of Albert Schweitzer. He was a philosopher, theologian, medical doctor, missionary, built hospitals in Africa, wrote a lot of interesting books. But when Albert Schweitzer looked at the problem we were talking about, he said, man has lost the ability to foresee and to forestall. He will end by destroying the earth. Now, there are a lot of people who talk that way right now about climate change, that if we don't do something, we will destroy the earth's abilities to sustain life. Well, that was Schweitzer's forecast. Well, here's a competing forecast. John Stuart Mill, another philosopher and an economist, in his Principles of Economics book in 1862, in his preface, he says, if from any revolution in nature the atmosphere became too scanty for consumption, air might acquire a very high marketable value. John Stuart Mill was not saying man will destroy the earth. He was saying before it gets that bad, something is going to happen. Markets are going to emerge, prices are going to show up, and in order to be able to use the environment, you will have to pay someone or abide by some rules. Two very different forecasts about the future of mankind in a world of scarcity where the environment becomes scarce. And in his discussion, John Stuart Mill talks about divers who go down under the sea. And he says that they pay someone to send them oxygen, which they can breathe, and they can count on those contracts being delivered because that's the way markets work. Now, let me get personal. This is my house in Clemson. My house is a little better than 110 years old. You can tell by looking at it, it's been around a while. But you will notice there's a wall around my house. And on one side of the wall, I have 3 D property rights. The first D is the property rights have been defined. I have a deed and it's recorded. That property has been defined. It has been defined in my name. The second D is it can be defended. If someone comes in against my invitation or against my will, I can call the police, I can call the sheriff, and they will come and defend my property rights. The third D is probably the more important one. It's a word we don't use a lot, lawyers use it, to devise. That is, I can transfer this property to someone else. So there are 3 Ds. It's been defined, it will be defended, and it can be sold to someone else. The fact that it can be sold to someone else changes my behavior because now my house is an asset. And I try to maintain the asset. One could say I try to maintain the value of the asset. Now, across the street from me is a restaurant, and they've got a great big garbage problem at that restaurant. If they don't do a good job in managing their garbage, I get a little bit upset, and I go and talk to the owners, and I say, wow, I wish you could do a little better job at. Well, why do I get upset? Well, maybe it's just because I don't like garbage. But I also get upset because I'm worried about my home and its value. And since I can market it, it causes me to be concerned about the environment around me. Even the amount of smoke and pollution in the air can reduce the value of my home. And so that causes me to become a little bit of an environmentalist. Now notice I've got those 3D rights on one side of the wall, but I don't have them on the other side of the wall. That's not private property. That's public property. That's owned by the city of Clemson. But guess what? I cut their grass too. Well, why do I cut their grass? Because it enhances the value of my house. The fact that there are property rights changes behavior. Now, on the other side of my house, there's that wall again. But you see those irises? I got those from my mother. My mother mailed those bulbs to me years ago, and I look forward to the spring when they come up in bloom. But notice where those bulbs are planted. They're planted on the side of the wall where I have 3D rights. Property rights change behavior. Now, there's something about human beings and their behavior with respect to the environment and with respect to property rights and rules and institutions that have been invented over time so that we can live and prosper. There are trade-offs. And that's why we're talking about this under the heading of economics. There are trade-offs. And so if there are no rules affecting our behavior, some people say there would be a race to the bottom. That was Albert Schweitzer. Man has lost the ability to foresee and to forestall. He will end by destroying the earth. That's a race to the bottom. But then this John Stuart Mill said, whoop, wait a minute, before that happens, there are going to be some rules and some prices and some changes so that it might be a race to the top. Which will it be? What I've just said in words, we can look at in a diagram, and the diagram has a name. It's called an environmental Kuznets curve. And that's because the person who thought of this relationship was named Kuznets, and he put his name on it. Notice that this is a relationship between the level of pollution, that's on the vertical axis, and income for a large population of people. The relationship says that at a low level of income, when people begin to try to figure out a way to live and to produce food and enough to stay alive, they don't worry too much about discharging pollution into the air or into the water. For the first half of that curve, the environment goes downhill as incomes go up. But then notice, as income continues to rise, it reaches a point where pollution stops getting worse, it starts falling, and gee whiz, if incomes continue to rise, the environment starts being taken care of, and things begin to look better. The water gets cleaner. The air has a lower concentration of pollution. Behavior changes with income. Now, for those of us in economics, that means that environmental quality is called a normal good. A normal good is one where you want more of it as your income goes up. And so the best protection for the environment is to make it possible for people to have higher incomes. That's one of the lessons in the curve. Now, let's talk about carbon emissions. Carbon emissions, climate change. What you're looking at here is data for 124 countries. On the horizontal axis, we're looking at GDP, the level of gross domestic product for those countries. On the vertical axis, you're looking at carbon dioxide emissions per capita. How much dirt gets blown into the air per person. Notice that the relationship for 1960 through 1980 says as income goes up, more carbon goes into the air. You can bet on it. That's what the data show us. But you say, but wait a minute. What about all that environmental Kuznets stuff you were just telling us about? Take a look at this. This is the relationship from 1984 to 2002 for the same countries. As income has gone up and you fit a curve to the data, guess what we see? The level of emissions per capita begins to turn downward. Thousands of changes have taken place. People have redesigned automobiles. In some countries, they've closed coal-burning power plants. All kinds of changes have taken place. Why? Because they want to maintain the value of their houses. They want to maintain the value of their communities. They want their assets to become more valuable. They don't want to have the ocean encroach on their cities. They are worried about their property. They may have other motivations as well, but we're talking about the economic motivations. And so they're turning points. They're turning points, and in my research and work over my lifetime, I have focused on what I call turning point stories about human beings and communities and how certain things got invented that caused there to be a fundamental change in the management of environmental assets. The first story I want to tell you took place on the Ruhr River in what was then Prussia. Today it is Germany. The key city on that river is the city of Essen, Germany, on the Ruhr. We're talking about that river. At the turn of the 19th century, back about 1880, the Ruhr River in Prussia was the most industrialized river in the world. It was steel making, it was coal, it was chemicals. And so this river was intensely used, producing all kinds of industrial products. During periods of low flow, the river would turn into a series of pools. And the more pollution that went in, the dirtier were the pools, and the pools got really bad, and so there would be typhoid epidemics, and people would die from bad water. And so in the late 19th century, in this highly industrialized world, notice that by 1912, the Essen Krupp Steel Company employed 70,000 people, just to give you an idea. And I'm describing some of the problems here in this panel. People were dying from water pollution. And so a group of businessmen got together for a beer hall, Essen, and they decided to do something. Now, these were not just ordinary business people. These were owners of some of those industrial plants. They decided they would turn the Ruhr River into private property. Now you could say, how could they do that? Well, there wasn't anybody trying to stop them. And so they incorporated the river. They made it private property. The first thing they did was to work to produce some dams to increase flow. And then they said, anybody who uses this river for anything will have to pay. If you want to pull water out of the river to drink, you're going to have to pay for it. Wow, here's John Stuart Mill. He said if it becomes through some revolution in nature, the atmosphere became too scanty to breathe, even air would have a price. Well, these guys put a price on water. And then they said, if you want to discharge anything into our river, notice whose it is, you'll have to pay, but there will be some things we will not allow to be discharged into our river, no matter how much you pay. And so they formed a corporation that incorporated the river. It is still there. In German, it's called the Ruhrverband, the Ruhr Corporation, or the Ruhr Association. When I visited their headquarters the first time and went in, as you walk into the headquarters building, the wall is filled with aquaria. They have a cross-section of all of the life that lives in that river, swimming in those aquaria. At the Ruhrverband, if someone wants to discharge waste into their river, they do all kinds of chemical treatments and so forth to determine what the waste might do and whether it can be handled by the river. That's how they go about determining the price you're going to have to pay. But the last step of the process is they dump some of the stuff into a cross-section of flora and fauna that live in that river. In other words, the Germans say science is great, but it's not quite good enough for our river. We want to make sure the river stays alive. Now, the king of Prussia liked what happened so well. People stopped dying from typhoid. Things got better. He liked it so well that he encouraged all of the rivers in his kingdom to be incorporated. And so the Wupper River turned into a corporation. The Emscher River turned into a corporation. And so anyone who wanted to build an industrial plant in Prussia had to go knock on the door of the owner of the river and say, hey, we want to build an industrial plant. Can we discharge into your river? And guess what? There was competition. Different prices were charged by the different rivers. And then there was technical change. The managers of the rivers began to figure out ways to add oxygen to the water, to improve the natural treatment of the water and the flow of the river itself. And so we get a turning point. We get a turning point. Incomes went up, the river went downhill. It got so bad that they did something about it. Incomes continued to rise, and the river became something beautiful. I'm showing you pictures of what Essen looked like at the time the Ruhrverband was formed. That's in the upper left-hand panel. There's Essen today. There's the Ruhr River today. And so it's possible then for rules to change, rules of property, so that now you can get a market solution. Now, the rules that change and the markets that form don't last forever. There are new approaches being used in the Ruhr River right now that embody rules from the European Union and so forth. And so different rivers, different places, different countries do things differently, but they are all systematically avoiding the tragedy of the commons. When I visited France and I talked to the operators of the rivers in France, guess what? Every river in France, every single river is managed as a river association. And you have to pay if you're going to discharge into a river in France. What do they do with the money? They use it to improve the surroundings, to improve the water quality, to maintain the liveliness of those rivers. Well, now, what about the United States? We don't have any markets managing water quality in the United States. If you want to build an industrial plant in the United States and discharge into a river, you've got to get a permit from the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. In order to get a permit, you have to build your plant in a particular way. You have to use particular technologies. And if you use the right technologies and get a permit, then you can discharge waste into the river, but you don't have to pay. If those same industrial firms decide they want to build a plant in Germany or in France, those people say, wait a minute, you got to do more than build a good engineered plant. In our world, the environment is too precious. We want to make certain that it gets treated with respect. And we have found out that if you make people pay for something, they show a little more respect for it. Now, let's get a little closer to home. The Tar-Pamlico River Basin, which is a few miles up the highway from where you are in Shelby, is one of the major fisheries on the Atlantic coast, both commercial and sport fishing. And the map that you're looking at here shows the drainage basin. The drainage basin for the Tar River goes all the way up to I-85. If you were driving to Washington, D.C. from Charlotte, you would see signs for the Tar River. It's a long river. It goes all the way to the Atlantic coast. There are no major cities in that map. As you can see, there are a lot of small, medium and small towns. Greenville is the largest city where the university is located. But here you have this wonderful Pamlico Sound, and there in that little photo, you see both sport fishing and commercial fishing in the same photo. So we want to talk about a story here that's going to sound a lot like the story I just told you about the Ruhr. Only this story has to do with a terrible fish kill. If you look at the photo down in the lower right-hand corner of this slide, what you see there are dead fish. What killed them? They suffocated. Most of the time when you see a fish kill, it's not because of poison in the water, it's because of an absence of oxygen in the water. They suffocate. Well, what happened to the oxygen? It was consumed by waste that was discharged, which became oxygenated. It decayed, and the oxygen got consumed, and the fish died. And so there was a gigantic fish kill in the 1980s there in the Pamlico Sound along the Tar River Basin, and something had to be done about it. It sort of sounds like the Ruhr story, doesn't it? A bit. Only it wasn't people dying, it was fish. Now, upstream from the Pamlico Sound are a lot of small farms. Not big ones, but small farms. You see these cattle up here walking in the creek? Those cattle discharge waste into that creek, and the creek flows into the river, and the river flows into the sound. And if you get enough non-point source pollution, as it is called, then what those cows do can affect fish life. If you have enough cows discharging enough waste into the river, then the river uses up the oxygen to decay that waste, and the fish die. And so the big issue was, how can we connect these cows to the sound and its problem? That was one of the challenges that had to be met. And so here in 1989, after this terrible fish kill, keep in mind now, by this time we had a very large U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. It was formed in 1970. The Federal Water Pollution Control Act was passed in 1972. It's been around a while now. All of the industrial plants located on the Tar River and at the Pamlico Sound had permits from the US EPA, or they would not have been allowed to operate. A lot of those plants were sewage treatment works. We call those publicly owned treatment works. They had permits. They were all operating within the limits of their permits, but the fish were dying. And so, wait a minute. EPA comes in and they say, look, we don't have any authority over the cows and the farmers upstream. We've got authority over all of the industrial point source dischargers. And so you're going to have to put on even more expensive controls. But here's the bad news. That's going to cost you $1 zillion, but once you get it all installed, this $100 million upgrade, guess what? The fish will still be dying. In other words, the problem that we control is industrial and sewage waste, but the problem that needs to be controlled is non-point source dischargers, the agricultural users in the area. And we don't have any authority over that. So they had a big meeting there in Greenville, and the EPA people came and told the story and said, here's what our law requires. It's going to require you to put on additional treatment, but it's not going to solve the problem, sorry. And we're going to leave you with this for a while to see if you can figure out something. And so the good people there in North Carolina began to apply a lot of common sense and said, woo, let's see if we can't think of a better solution than spending $100 million and still having dead fish. There were some people there from the Environmental Defense Fund, a large leading environmental organization. The people from Environmental Defense wanted to defend the environment. They wanted the fish to keep living. They weren't worried about what EPA rules and regulations required. They were worried about the environment. The people there in the Tar Pamlico region thought so much of their river and their community that they had formed a nonprofit corporation. Wow, this is beginning to sound familiar, isn't it? They had formed a Tar Pamlico Foundation, a corporation. And the purpose of the corporation was to do things to enhance the beauty of the region, to protect the natural resources, and to try to make life better. Wow, sounds like property rights, doesn't it? And so the people all came together and they came up with an idea. And they said, here's what we suggest. Anybody who discharges waste into our river will pay. Okay. And we'll raise the price, and that means they'll discharge less. But somebody said, but wait a minute. We've already been told that if we all cut back, the fish will still die. Wait, they said, but wait, you haven't heard the whole story. We're going to put this money in a bank account, and guess what we're going to do with it? We're going to hire some folks to go up and talk to the farmers upstream. And we're going to say, hey, we'd like to write a contract with you, enforceable in a court of law. We want to pay you to plant some buffer strips along the creeks and small inlets to the rivers. And we want to pay you to confine your cattle away from the discharge points. We want to pay you to change the kind of fertilizer that you're using so that when it rains and we get runoff, we won't get as much phosphate and nitrogen flowing into the river, because phosphate and nitrates cause algae to grow. And when the algae grows and dies, it decays and consumes oxygen. So we want to write some contracts. We're going to pay you to change your behavior, and you can make money out of it. That's called gains from trade. In other words, we're going to form a market for the right to discharge into the Tar Pamlico River Basin. That was their idea. And so the EPA people came back, and the good people from the North Carolina Department of Natural Resources came back and said, hey, let's listen to the story. And of course, I'm giving you the story in a very informal way. And everybody said, hey, that's a great story, but guess what? It's illegal. Federal law does not sanction that kind of behavior. Congress, in its wisdom, passed a law that says everybody has to put machinery on their plants, and there are lots of it, and run the machinery, and that's supposed to take care of the environment. It's just that Congress didn't look far enough ahead to say that that wouldn't solve the problem. And so there would be no enforcement under federal law unless you can get some kind of exemption. And so who do you suppose came to bat and said, hey, wait a minute, in order for there to be a problem with law enforcement under the regulations, someone has to complain, right? And the EPA people said, right, there has to be someone who complains. Someone has to bring suit under the Federal Water Pollution Control Act saying the law is not being applied legally, right? EPA says, right. And then this voice said, and who is it that usually sues? And EPA says, Environmental Defense Fund. Environmental organizations are the ones who bring suit to make certain that our laws are enforced as they were written. And so the people from the Environmental Defense Fund said, well, what if we testified in favor of the Tar Pamlico River Basin Association and decided we would not sue? And so that was what happened. And so the Tar Pamlico River Basin Association came into being. And now, since you're economic students, you get to see a diagram. The diagram here shows you a picture of the problem. Up at the top, you see that line that says publicly owned treatment works unit cost. That's a sewage treatment plant. It costs a typical sewage treatment plant on the Tar River $37 to remove a pound of nitrogen or nitrates from their waste. Now, the nitrates feed the algae. The algae die and decay and consume the oxygen, and that kills the fish. There's the story. Now then, there's Farmer Jones down there who for 1 penny, just spending 1 penny, can avoid a pound of discharge of nitrogen into that river for 1 penny. What you're looking at is called potential for gains from trade. It costs one party $37. It costs somebody else 1 penny. Well, how do you ever get those two parties together? You get them together by forming a market. And if there's a marketplace and a broker, the broker says, hey, I can go get something for a penny and sell it for $37. Woo! What a great possibility. And so, wait a minute, there's another farmer who says, now notice that dashed line that's going up? That's a supply curve. That's the supply curve of nitrogen reductions. The higher the price, the more gets supplied. And so now there are gains from trade. Instead of spending $100 million, which is what EPA said these folks would have to spend, they probably spent 1/10 of that. No more fish kills. Oh, occasionally they have something that comes with hurricanes. But the problem basically got solved at that time by way of property rights and by way of markets. Now, to some extent, the problems that I have just talked about with water pollution and tar Pamlico and the Ruhr, and there are other stories that we could tell, those problems are simpler than problems associated with climate change. Why are they simpler? Because a discharge of carbon into the atmosphere from anywhere on Earth makes its way into the upper atmosphere. So unlike discharging nitrogen into the Tar River that makes itself into the Pamlico Sound, nobody in France is worried about that. But somebody in France might be worried about the amount of carbon that gets emitted from the United States, or somebody in the United States may be worried about the amount of carbon that gets emitted from the millions of fireplaces in rural India where people burn charcoal in order to cook and stay warm. We're all connected, but there is no connecting government. There isn't a world EPA. There is no unit with the authority to enforce changes of behavior worldwide. And I would interject, thank goodness that that is the case. Otherwise, there might be the wrong party that comes into power, depending on your preferences, who would enforce all kinds of behavior on people worldwide. And so we want to, as human beings, we want to try to find solutions that are decentralized instead of centralized. You remember that diagram that I showed you a while back that showed discharges of carbon and GDP? I showed you about 40 years of data, and as we looked at the more current panel, we noticed that as incomes were rising, the amount of carbon being discharged was going down. So there are sometimes what I call hidden markets at play. We've got visible markets That's like the Tarpamlico River Basin Association or the Roofer Bond there in Essen. Those are visible markets, and you can go to that marketplace and talk to a salesperson and say, hey, I want to discharge something in the river. What have I got to pay? It's like going and getting your laundry out of the laundry and saying, how much have I got to pay to get my shirts back? It's a visible market. But then there are hidden markets. And an example of a hidden market that relates to carbon reductions is what is going on now with mutual funds worldwide. There are trillion-dollar mutual funds. There are investors who want to invest their money in corporations and other enterprises that are working to reduce the amount of carbon emissions they put into the air. We're talking about trillions of dollars. And so there are ordinary people out there who say, I'm going to take my retirement funds and I'm going to invest them into some exchange traded funds, but I'm not going to invest in corporations that blow carbon into the air. I'm going to invest in corporations and enterprises who do the reverse. And if there are enough people like me, that means they will have access to capital at a lower cost than will those corporations that want to blow a lot of carbon in the air. And so what have I got here? I've got a market solution that is working worldwide now. And so now there are corporations who are saying, wow, we better kind of tidy up our act. That'll give us access to more capital. And if we can get more capital, we can build more plants and we can operate more extensively. But in order to do that, we've got to cut back on our carbon emissions. And so, again, it's a human story. It's a story about prices. It's a story about property rights. And it's a story about markets and how sometimes the markets are visible and sometimes they are invisible, but they can still be working. And so BlackRock, the world's largest fund manager, now has $7 trillion in various holdings. And what I'm describing here on this panel gives you a little bit of detail about what is going on in financial markets now that is affecting climate change. And so we don't have to form a world government with an army of environmental policemen who go out and arrest people for blowing carbon into the air worldwide. We know we can't do that as human beings. That's not feasible. But it is possible through different approaches to call on market forces to assist where there are concerns about environmental quality and what might be done to protect it. And so there's our friend Adam Smith and his famous quotation in The Wealth of Nations. Adam Smith reminded us of his discovery. This was a discovery. This was not widely known in Adam Smith's lifetime. In his book, which was published in 1776, see, Adam Smith discovered and elaborated on the notion of gains from trade, and that in the process of taking care of another person's needs for food, or for a glass of beer, or for a hamburger, in the process of helping someone else satisfy their needs, our needs get satisfied as well. We get an income. The more we do to take care of someone else through an enterprise, the more they will do for us. Our customers will help us to prosper if we help them to find happiness. And so that was Adam Smith's great insight. If we can find ways for people to prosper by keeping the environment cleaner, we'll get more of it. And so then it may be possible for property rights and markets to assist us in protecting environmental quality. Now I'm going to stop and see if I have any questions. And so I'm on pause, and I'm going to stop sharing this screen. Let's see if that works. Yep. Okay.
Great, thank you.
Good.
One question that one of our students had is, how have there been any creative solutions, marketplace solutions that did not work to improve the environment?
Generally speaking, the reason they have not worked in the United States has to do with the basic blueprint, and I made allusions to it, the basic blueprint of our environmental statutes. Both of the Clean Air Act, which was passed in 1970 and amended many times since then, and the Federal Water Pollution Control Act of 1972 and amended many times. Both of those statutes are based on command and control regulation, technology-based. And so anything that is done that would be based on primarily market forces then is working against. It's an upstream battle. In order for markets to function in rivers, for example, in the United States, and they are functioning, many states, Pennsylvania has perhaps the most extensive array of these. The players in those markets still must meet the technology-based standard, and then they can engage in market transactions because of the way our statutes are based. And so that is the major hurdle that precludes much in the way of market orientation. I mentioned common law, which was the law, is still the law, but statute law always trumps common law protections. And so again, while common law would offer a remedy for a downstream party, downstream in air or water, to bring an action against a polluter, federal statutes can preclude or limit the use of common law remedies. And so in a way, we have battling institutions. There's competition with institutions that human beings invent and try out. A wonderful thing about our country is that we have 50 states. We have 50 different common law activities, 50 state common law that can vary. So we have experiments that are taking place. States are operating under the umbrella of the US EPA, but there's still experimentation, particularly during times of environmental stress. As with the Ruhr story, as with the Tar Pamlico story, it's when things are just not working under the old rules that human communities get together and say, damn, we've got to find a better way to deal with this, and we get creative and inventive. I've given you a long answer to a really interesting question.
Well, we appreciate it. And then so you're talking about the regulations sometimes are interfering with these creative solutions. And so going back to your bootleggers and Baptists.
Yes.
Who benefits, who is the beneficiary when the regulations are so in stifling creativity?
I surely do thank you for that question. When I mentioned the Federal Air Pollution Control, the Clean Air Act of 1970, a senator from Maine, Edmund Muskie, was the author. His committee, Public Works Committee in the US Senate, was writing that statute. Remember, there were no federal air pollution control regulations. These are getting invented in 1970. Senator Muskie was writing the statute. The statute was in a final draft. The final draft said, we will use performance standards to control air pollution in the United States. Performance standards mean we're not going to tell you how to design your plant. We're going to protect the environment. We're focusing on outcomes, and if you don't get it right, you're going to have to pay. We don't care how you build plants. We will be measuring what you do to the environment, and you will pay if you don't get it right. That's called a performance standard. That means firms compete to find the lowest cost way, just as they did over in the Ruhr with water pollution. Just as that statute was about to become final, there's competition for who's going to be president of the United States, and Muskie is running. He wants to be president. Richard Nixon was president, and he wanted to serve another term. Nixon wanted to be known as the environment president. And he brings his people together and say, hey, we want to be tough on polluters. We want to make them pay with machinery. In other words, command and control came in, and Mr. Muskie revised his statute, and we ended up with command and control technology-based regulation. All right, now who wins? The environmental community liked it because they said, look, the tougher we are on polluters, the better we like it, because they're the guys that have goofed everything up. But then there was somebody else who liked it, the polluters. Because the statute said there will be stricter standards imposed on new plants than on existing plants. Whoa. Well, what if I'm an existing steel maker? You're telling me that if another competitor wants to come into my region and produce steel, they will have to spend more to build their plant? That's right. They'll have to use the most modern technology available, and we will hold their feet to the fire. Now, the bootlegger Baptist theory says that when we have two groups of people favoring the same regulatory outcome, one group called Baptists, and they're favoring it because they're taking the moral high ground. They want the world to be a better place as they define it. And so Baptists traditionally like laws that close down liquor stores on Sundays. I'm a Methodist. Methodists do also. And so they like to close down the liquor stores on Sunday. Well, there's another group that likes to have the liquor stores closed on Sunday too. Those are the bootleggers. They buy their booze on Saturday and they sell it on Sunday at a premium, and they make money while the Baptists make sure the law is enforced. Now let's go back to the water quality story. Command and control regulation, where you set stricter standards for new sources than for old ones, raises rivals' costs. The existing firms are the bootleggers. They love it. The environmental community, those people who love the environment and they want to see it protected, and the tougher you are on polluters, the better they like it. They like the command and control too. And so they march in the street with banners saying, let's keep the environment clean, and the bootleggers march to the bank with profits that they make by cartelizing their industry under the statutes. And so then when people say, well, let's go to a market-based approach, let's forget about all this command and control technology stuff. Let's do it the way they do in France, or let's do it the way they do on the Ruhr. Who do you think is going to object? The bootleggers. You've got to work that political problem out. And so you've given me the opportunity to talk about bootleggers and Baptists, and you can tell that that requires a long discussion. Thanks so much for your question.
Well, we've enjoyed, I've used that example a lot in class when we try to think about the unseen beneficiaries of any problems.
All right.
Or different, just trying to think in an economic way.
Good for you.
Yes, sir.
Well, it's been a pleasure being with you all today.
Yes, sir. Thank you so much. We really appreciate your insights and appreciate that you took the time to speak with us today.
Okay. Good luck to you.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.